we recognize that all is well as long as we have God in our world. Indeed, I appreciate that song very much. I'd like to tell you a little bit of background about why I pick a particular sermon. Sometimes I think it kind of helps to understand the reason and maybe help you to understand a little bit more about where my mind was in talking about it. I like to listen to music in the car when I'm driving. It's really about the only time that I do listen to music. But before I got my hearing aids, a lot of times I really didn't know the lyrics of the songs. And sometimes in talking with a friend of mine afterward about, oh, I really like this song, and they kind of look at me, well, do you know what that song says? And no, what does it say? And then sometimes I decide I don't like that song anymore. This song is one that I've always known the lyrics to. It's very clear, distinct, and easy to understand, and it's horrible. It's absolutely horrible. It's a beautiful song. The man who wrote the song has a beautiful voice. The music of the song, the melody is very pretty. The words are, quite honestly, blasphemy. Absolute blasphemy. It is a song of nonviolence, which I think is wonderful. But the suggestion to get rid of violence is to get rid of God. The very first line of the song, Imagine, is the name of the song. The very first line of the song is, imagine no heaven. That's the solution to getting rid of violence in this world. Just think of, there is no heaven, there is no hell. Later on it goes on to say, there is no religion too. That's the solution to a world full of violence. And it's just as wrong as it can possibly be. But for our lesson this morning, I want to go ahead and let's just go through that exercise that the author of this song has for us. I'd like for us to just do what he suggests that we do. Let's imagine a world without God. Imagine a world without heaven, without hell, without religion. And let's see what that world would be like. Before we get into that, thank you for being here today. It is wonderful when you can see a building full of people who have taken time out of their day and said, I want to worship my God. It is a choice that people make, and I believe it is the right choice. I believe it's a choice different from what the author of the song we're going to be looking at. It's a choice different than the what need be. It is encouraging to me, it's encouraging to everyone else who has gathered here, that we can offer our worship together, that we can declare together what God means to us. And thank you for choosing to be a part of that. Let's go back to the very beginning, and even though this song is blasphemy, I think at the beginning I want to start with just a little bit of humor. I want you to think about what it would have been like at the very beginning. In Genesis chapter 1 and 2, we find the story of the creation. We find where God spoke into existence the entire world and everything about it. And in particular in chapter 2, God made a special garden. That in this world that he's already described as being very good, God made a special garden with everything that was pleasing for food. Everything was there. And in that garden, he placed the man and woman he created. And then in chapter 3, we find where Satan came to that garden. And let's imagine just a little bit. Satan comes up to Eve in the form of a serpent. Hey, Eve, do you know what I want you to think about? I want you to think about how much better this place would be if you stopped listening to the one who made it. He kind of looks around and says, you do know we call this place paradise, don't you? Yeah, I know that, but think how much better it would be if you don't listen to the one who made it and listen to me instead. Okay, let me have some of that fruit. And then she goes to Adam and said, hey, this snake came up to me and told me to think about how much better this place would be if we stopped listening to God and we listened to the snake instead. Adam, you do know we call this place paradise, don't you? Yeah, I know, but really, think about how much better it's going to be. Okay, I'll listen to you instead of listening to God. It seems kind of silly, doesn't it? Come back to that thought a little bit later. Let's go back to the premise of the song. And I'm falling behind on my chart, on my slides again. Let's imagine what the world would be like without heaven, without hell, without religion. What is a world without God like? There's a line in the song that says, it's not hard to do. And I agree. That's absolutely true. It's not hard to do because it doesn't take imagination. We actually see what the world was like when men stopped listening to God. We saw it in the Garden of Eden. They had to leave. There was a cherubim that blocked them from ever coming back to that tree of life. So we don't have to imagine what it was like when they listened to Satan instead of listening to God. And it's not hard for us to imagine what the world would be like if there was no God. We find it from the very beginning. It was a world that was filled with evil in Genesis chapter 6. We're told that the sons of men went into the daughters of God, and there was intermarriage between them, intermixing between them. In other words, there was a separation between God's people and those who were not God's people, and that separation became blended, was taken away. And the result of that, we're told, is the thoughts and intents of man's heart was evil continuously. When they stopped listening to God, this world was filled with evil. It was so evil that there were only 8 people that God could find who weren't thinking about evil continuously. So that's the world that he wants us to imagine. It's not the kind of world that I want to be a part of. And yet that's the world that we saw. I've already mentioned that in chapter 1 and verse 31, the writer tells us that God looked at everything he created and it was all very good. So we went from very good to filled with evil continuously, and the only change was the fact that they stopped listening to God. That song that tells us think about the world without that, it's not the kind of world I want to think about. But not only that, we find that it's a world that is filled with confusion. Nobody knows what's going on. Nobody understands. Do you remember at the trial of Jesus, where Jesus was brought before Pilate? And John's the one who tells us this personal interaction between Pilate and Jesus. And Pilate says, "Are you really the king of the Jews?" And Jesus says, "Well, who told you that? Did that come from, did you think of that on your own, or did the Jews tell you that?" And the point Jesus was trying to get Pilate to recognize is that you need to recognize they're feeding you a lie. They're lying to you. Pilate says, "I don't know." And Jesus goes on to say, "But I did come to bring truth into this world." And do you remember Pilate's response to that? What is truth? Pilate was so confused, following the philosophy of the Greeks and the Romans, that he believed there really is no way to know what is true. That was common in that time. Their philosophers argued about what is truth, and many of them had just decided there was no way to know. Again, this is a world without God, is a world of confusion, a world of doubt, a world that has no idea where they're going or what they're doing. And finally, a world without God is a world that is hopeless. A world that has no direction, no goal, no final destination. Why are we here? What are we supposed to do? How do we know we've gotten there? Adam's talked a little bit about Greek philosophy that he found, particularly in Athens. And very much Athenian Greek philosophy was very much based on this idea. We really don't know what we're doing. What's the purpose? We find that in the book of Ecclesiastes. Remember how the book of Ecclesiastes starts out? I put my mind to search and try everything, and I found that everything is vanity. It's all emptiness. A world without God is a world without hope. Now let's imagine. Think about how wonderful that world would be. Well, that world is not wonderful at all. And I suspect that if we stopped at this point, probably everybody in this room would say, here, I really appreciate you showing how blasphemous that song is. I really appreciate the fact that you've shown that a world without God is not what any of us want to be a part of. And that's true, but that's only the introduction. Sorry, you're not leaving early. That's just to get us to the primary point of our lesson this morning. What about your world? What would your world be like without God? I'm not talking about life-changing events like, would there be a worldwide catastrophic flood that would cover all the mountains and destroy all living being as we know it? I'm just simply asking your personal world, what would it be like if you didn't listen to God? If you believed the message of Satan, this world would be better without God. What would your life be like? And I'm going to ask the same three questions. Would it be filled with evil? Would your world be evil if you weren't listening to God? I don't think there's many people here that say, oh yeah, that'd be me. I'd be the most evil person on the face of this earth if I wasn't listening to God. I just want to get out there and I want to ruin everybody else's life. I want to do everything evil. I love to do evil. I don't think there's anybody here today who would say that. Let me ask it a different question, or in a different way. Would you be selfish and self-centered? Would you care more about your own concerns than to be concerned about God's things or good things? I don't know about you, but even just thinking about that, I start to go, whoops. Let me think about it this way. Who did Jesus come to call? Matthew chapter 9 and verse 13, we find one of the many examples where the Pharisees were looking at the life of Jesus and criticizing the way that he was going about things, particularly the people that he was associating with. And Jesus looked at them and told them a parable and said, who goes to see a physician? Who goes to see a doctor? Now, I know nowadays we have what are called well visits. I have to do that once a year to do my physical for work. But for the most part, it's sick people. Jesus says that the sick are the ones who go to see a physician. I came to call not the righteous, but the sinners. What would your world be like if you didn't have Jesus? Well, part of it is you'd be thinking, I'm self-righteous. I don't need Jesus. Far too many people in this world think that way. But instead, you need to realize that your world, without God, you absolutely would be evil. And I don't mean to be insulting about that, but I'm just being honest. And I hope you'll be honest with yourself also. Because you didn't come to Jesus until you recognized you were a sinner. You didn't come to Jesus until you recognized that you were evil. What would your world be like without Jesus? Would you be confused? Would you be wondering, what's the purpose of life? Why am I here? What am I supposed to do? Where am I going? Maybe you do. Maybe you recognize that. Maybe you recognize that Jesus gives you purpose, gives you meaning. As we notice in the book of Ecclesiastes, that writer talking about the fact that all is vanity. And of course, we know the conclusion of the matter is, fear God and keep his commandments. That is the whole duty of man. What would your world be without God? It would be a world of confusion. I would suggest to the author of this song proved his confusion. What would your world be without God? Would you feel hopeless? Would you feel like you really don't have an answer for those difficult times? Would you feel like there's just, I don't know what to do. I have no answer. I don't know how to get through this. We find in 2 Corinthians chapter 1. 2 Corinthians chapter 1 and beginning verse 8. Paul says, we don't want you to be unaware, brethren, of our affliction which came to us in Asia, that we were burdened excessively beyond our strength, so that we despaired of life. What would your life be without God? Paul described it pretty well there. Burdened excessively, despairing of life itself. But he didn't stop. That letter is not just 8 verses long. It continues on in verse 9. Indeed, we had the sentence of death within ourselves, in order that we should not trust in ourselves, but in God who raises the dead, who delivered us from so great a peril of death and will deliver us, he on whom we have set our hope, and he will yet deliver us. Paul says, I'm not hopeless. As I faced that difficult challenge, as I despaired even of life itself, even as I had that death sentence placed on me, and I don't know which one of the many times in Paul's life he might have been talking about at this point. But regardless of whatever time it was, Paul remembered God is the one who's going to get me through this. And in fact, that was his hope. And so not only was it just simply, well, this is my last hope, I guess this is what I've got to trust in, he's confident. He is going on to write this letter to tell them, because of the confidence that I had, the comfort that I had from God, I am going to comfort you. I'm going to share my hope with you. I'm going to share my God with you. So I ask this question, what about your world? Imagine what your world would be like without God. And again, we could stop at that point, and the lesson, I think, hopefully got a little bit more personal, got a little bit closer, but that's just to lead us to our next point. The next point is to ask the question even more directly. How is your world different with God? For those of you who have made a commitment to Jesus Christ in your life, this is no longer imagination. Now I'm asking you to think about what has changed. You don't have to answer to me, but what can you tell God is different about your life because you said there is a God and I am going to serve him? And let me go back through our same questions. And again, think about what is different in my life. You see, morality is something that sociologists study these kind of things. They'll talk about how a young child, their morality is really set for them by their parents, by their culture. It's a great lesson in itself and why it's so important for parents to be involved in their children. Don't just send them off to boarding school somewhere. Don't just send them off thinking, well, the school will take care of them, the church is going to take care of them, somebody else is going to take care of them. You have a responsibility to set their morality early in life. That's a very grave responsibility that parents have. But then as you become older, as you start to be able to rationally think about things that are right and wrong, you start setting your own morality. And you set that morality based on the decisions that you make. Decisions that are based on, do I believe in God? Do I have something else that I believe in? Do I believe only in myself? That's going to set your moral stature. It's going to set who you are, why you make the kind of decisions that you make. How has that been affected by your commitment to say, Jesus Christ is my Lord? How has that changed? And let me emphasize that word, change. Because if it hasn't changed, I'm going to ask you, is Jesus really your Lord? How has your life, your thoughts, your actions changed because you said, Jesus is the Son of God, and I commit myself to him for the remainder of my life? What has changed since then? What comes from your faith? I mentioned earlier that moral structure from the very beginning is set by our parents. We find an example of Paul pointing this out with Timothy. In 2 Timothy 1, he talks about the faith that existed first in his grandmother and his mother, and he says, I'm sure is in you also. That faith started from them, but Paul says it's now in you. What kind of changes have occurred in your life, in your thoughts, because of the fact that you made the commitment to put Jesus in your life? And I mentioned the idea of actions and thoughts. We all see actions. I can see what you do. I can see the fruits of, where your mind is, what your goals are, what your standards are. I can see if you act in an evil way. I can see if you act in a confused way. I can see if you act in a way that you are hopeless. And certainly the Bible talks about that idea. It talks about actions that we do. But I also mentioned the idea of thoughts. And even though I presented to you the idea of thought and action, I believe the Bible actually says they come the other direction. What changes first is your thought. And then because of the change in thought, there will be a change in action. And God is the only one who can see those thoughts. We discussed it in our Hebrews class about the Word of God. It's living and active and sharper than any two-edged sword, able to divide the thoughts and intentions of the heart. Your heart, your mind, your being is laid open by the Word of God before God. He sees what you think. Do you think about God? Are your thoughts guided by God? Is everything about your being a part of your relationship with God? And then if that be true, then your actions will also be different. We actually had that question in our class this morning about this change in thoughts and in actions. And I didn't talk a whole lot more about it then because I knew I was going to talk about it here. But when we go back to how we started this lesson, imagine a world without God, imagine your world without God, and more appropriately, imagine your world with God. What has changed? And then the final question I've already got on the board, what continues to change? So what do you mean? I changed to put God first. It's much more than just a one-time action or a one-time thought. If you look in 2 Peter chapter 1, let me start, actually, 1 Peter chapter 3. 1 Peter chapter 3, this is a verse I've known many times, used many times in sermons. And I remember, I don't remember what year it was, but I just remember at one point rereading that verse again and just stopping and saying, oh, whoa, how did I miss that so many times? 1 Peter 3, verse 15. But sanctify Christ as Lord in your hearts, always being ready to make a defense to everyone who asks you to give an account for the hope that is in you, yet with gentleness and reverence. Go back to that very first phrase. Sanctify Christ as Lord in your hearts. Who does the sanctifying most of the time? Well, it's God. God sanctifies me. He has sanctified his people. The book of Leviticus made that point so very clear. It is emphasized all through. God is the one who sanctifies. But Peter, in writing to people, says, you sanctify Christ. I can't do that. I don't have the ability to be able to sanctify Christ. I can't make Christ any more sanctified than he already is. But look at the context. Look at the place. Sanctify Christ in your heart. That goes back to that question we just asked. What has changed in your thought? What has changed in your heart now that you made a commitment to Christ? Has he been sanctified in your heart? Because if he is sanctified in your heart, then all the other things that we talk about, that we'll be ready to defend him. Christ is sacred in my heart. I will defend him to the death. Because he's that special in my heart. I will tell you what my hope is. I will defend him with gentleness and reverence because that's what he did. Now let's go to 2 Peter chapter 1. Beginning in verse 5, we find what we often call the Christian virtues. And I've had lessons and I've seen lessons that talk about this building one upon another and how you add one on top of another and continue to build them all up as you reach for this pinnacle of Christian love. And it's an excellent study to do. But verse 8 is the one that really hits home. For if these are yours and are increasing, they render you neither useless nor unfruitful in the true knowledge of our Lord Jesus Christ. Peter says, first of all, he says there's 7 things here that you need to keep adding on top of one another. And then he says about the totality of those, that you need to own them, you need to hold them, and they need to be continuing to increase within you. So that's why I asked the question. What continues to change in your world with God? What continues to change in the way you think? And as a result, in the way you act? It's challenging. But that's what the challenge of the cross is. Our God took on our nature to come and to live among us, to be persecuted by us, to be put to death by us. All right, let's go back to that funny little story I asked you to talk about. Satan going to Eve and saying, hey, I can make this place better. This is paradise. How are you going to make it better? Stop listening to the one who made it and listen to me instead. What did you think of Eve? We probably all thought that was a pretty foolish choice she made. And it was. I'm very familiar with it because it's a choice I've made many times. You have too. Satan's a very good salesman. He works. So how has my life changed because I started listening to God once again? How do I want to ensure that I don't listen to Satan again? That's ultimately the point of this lesson. Imagine what your world would be like without God. Imagine what your world can continue to be with God. Because that brings us back to paradise. That's the relationship we have with God in Jesus Christ right now. We have paradise. As long as we continue to keep listening to him, we abide in his paradise. A world that is not filled with evil but good and love. A world that is not filled with confusion but understanding and truth. A world that is not filled with despair and hopelessness, but a world of hope that gives us comfort. Imagine that world. That is a world in which we can, going back to our psalm one more time, we can live in peace. Because that's what Jesus promised. He is the Prince of Peace. If that is not your world, what do you need to do to change it? Who do you need to start listening to? We invite you to come forward now as we stand and sing the song that has been chosen.